A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I used to think family dinners were sacred, a time when laughter echoed and memories were created, but that all changed when Uncle Greg, who has an uncanny ability to slip venomous remarks into jovial conversations, decided to comment on my smile. It was supposed to be a routine Sunday evening. My mother had spent the entire day cooking her famous lasagna while my father polished his collection of vintage wine, and the aroma normally brought me a sense of comfort. As we gathered around the oversized table, my mother's excitement was palpable as she presented the meal, her warm smile contrasting sharply with the chill that settled in the air as Uncle Greg leaned in, eyes glinting with mischief, and said, "What happened to your smile, anyway? It looks different." At that moment, a thunderbolt struck within me. My mind raced back to the summer I turned 14, the summer my childhood was ripped from me when I discovered Vine, a predator masquerading as a social media platform where I was the star of ridicule with a series of leaked videos that showcased my awkwardness and strange, crooked grin, dictated by the braces that had turned me into a target for the school bullies. Laughter had morphed into tears, and that distant, carefree girl was just a haunting memory as my smile had become a mask for my pain, a fragile shield behind which I'd concealed years of insecurity and self-loathing. I froze, feeling the eyes of my entire family on me. The youngest cousins were giggling by the dessert plates, my older sister was nervously flicking her gaze between me and my uncle, and my parents were exchanging worried looks, as if they could sense the storm brewing beneath the surface, the air thick with tension waiting to burst. Then, before I knew it, the acidic words were spilling from my mouth like a torrent. "What's wrong with my smile?" The table fell silent, forks paused midair, and for a fraction of a second, time felt suspended. Uncle Greg chuckled, half in jest and half in malice. "What happened to the girl who used to light up the room with that dorky grin?" I could see it then, the flicker of glee in his eyes as if my vulnerability nourished him. In that instant, the jubilant laughter of the evening faded into an oppressive silence, and with every ounce of grief I harbored, I vented, unleashing suppressed anger and frustration that spiraled into a whirlwind of words, attacking not just Greg but the entire facade of family gatherings, laying bare the scars that were traditionally covered with laughter. Do you think I want to be reminded of how different I am? Of the countless nights I spent crying in front of a mirror wishing to fit in? And as I spoke, it was as though a dam broke. My family members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the shock of the sudden outburst tangling their hearts in conflicting emotions. My mother looked hurt, as though I'd pulled back the curtain on a family secret, while my father, usually the peacemaker, sat, wide-eyed, surprised at the tempest that had erupted from his adoring daughter. Then it happened. My sister, usually the calmest of us all, stepped in, her face pale as she bitterly remarked, "You're not a walking tragedy. Get a grip. This is just a dinner." The words snapped like a rubber band, ricocheting through the room and into every soul present. The atmosphere shifted dramatically. What was once an ambient family gathering had transformed into a battleground where everyone was armed with unspoken feelings. It felt surreal, our laughter replaced by an awkwardness thick enough to slice. I felt lost, standing amidst the wreckage of my own emotions, the insult consuming me, gnawing at my insides. I could see my uncle's pleasure, feeding on the drama he had awakened, and it infuriated me further. Why couldn't they understand that family should be a sanctuary, a place I could shield myself from the world's cruelties? And when I finally saw my father's gaze, a mix of pity and disappointment, I realized I had crossed a line that would never be uncrossed. The dinner plates were forgotten, the clinking of utensils was replaced by my heaving breaths, and the tension became palpable, everyone holding their breath, teetering on the edge of the abyss. Then Mom, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and sorrow, finally spoke, her voice trembling, "You've ruined this dinner, all of you. Greg, you need to learn when to keep your mouth shut, and you." She turned to me, disappointment etched across her features. "You should know better than to let it get to you. We're family." I gaped, the weight of it hitting me like a freight train. I had acted out, sure, but so had Uncle Greg, yet somehow, I was the villain in this narrative. As the discomfort and hostility wrapped around us like a suffocating blanket, I felt detached, an observer in my own life, watching the family I once adored crumble under the strain of unaddressed grievances and unexpressed emotions. I stormed out, tears cascading down my cheeks as the darkened evening air hit me. I didn't hear the poker-faced exchanges or the strained whispers following my exit. I simply wrapped my arms around my knees under the stars, wondering if I had truly ruined the dinner or merely laid bare the fractures that had always lurked beneath the surface, awaiting the perfect moment to shatter our fragile facade. As the night wore on, the moon hung heavy with judgment, and deep down, I felt it, the feeling that perhaps we were all broken, cracking beneath the weight of unspoken words, yet desperate to pretend we were fine. But for one fleeting moment, amidst the chaos and heartbreak, I wished someone would have just acknowledged the depth of my hurt, instead of dismissing me as the antagonist of the family drama and making me wonder if, maybe, it was time to stop pretending those cracks didn't exist. The reality was, we each wore our own masks. Uncle Greg wore his of laughter while my family donned theirs of indifference, and that night, I unveiled mine, the one marred by hurt but precious in its truth, and I realized, maybe, the real tragedy wasn't in my smile but in the silence that had allowed them to linger. I never thought a simple decision about Christmas morning would spiral into something that felt like a living nightmare, but here we are. My husband and I had always imagined our children waking up to a sea of colorful wrapping paper, their laughter and innocence filling the air like the smell of fresh pine from our tree. So, when my husband's parents were insistent about joining us to watch our kids open their gifts, I hesitated, not because I didn't want them there, but because of the dark, quiet secrets that always seemed to surface whenever I spent time with them. See, my in-laws have this unsettling ability to twist every joyful occasion into an underlying tension, an atmosphere thick enough to cut with a knife. The first Christmas we spent together, they arrived early, their smiles stretched too wide, their eyes too focused on my every move as I tried to set the scene of holiday cheer, and I remember my daughter's joyous squeal being overshadowed by a comment from my mother-in-law about how children shouldn't be spoiled with so much. That experience pushed me to set boundaries, and I was firm this year. I want this to be a special moment just for us, I told my husband, who reluctantly agreed, aware of the strange weight our in-laws carried in our lives, almost like a curse that cast shadows over even the happiest days. But then Christmas morning arrived, and my excitement quickly turned into dread when I saw a text from my mother-in-law at 5 a.m., saying she couldn't wait to see them, her unwavering enthusiasm creeping under my skin like ice. I tried to shake off the unease, but it lingered like a storm cloud as I sipped my coffee, the aroma mingling with the unmistakable scent of impending chaos. I insisted to my husband that the whole family could come over later, after the presents, but he had that look, one of silent defiance, as if stepping into the battlefield to protect what little peace we had left. As the hour approached for the kids to wake, I went into survival mode, meticulously hand-picking the ornaments our daughter had decorated the night before, but the glee in my heart felt hollow. The little ones bounded in, their eyes sparkling brighter than any Christmas light, and I could almost forget the impending doom at my back, that is, until the doorbell rang just when they were about to dive into the pile of gifts. I froze, breath hitching in my throat. My husband shot me a panicked look, and I felt a wave of nausea hit me as I could only imagine who stood on the other side. Sure enough, there they were, my in-laws, faces beaming, clutching bags filled with their own presents, as if it were theirs to share. My body reacted instinctively. I stepped in front of the kids as if I could shield them from this intruding wave, all my intentions to keep Christmas pure unraveling before my eyes. We agreed, I stuttered, my voice barely a whisper but sharp enough for them to hear. We wanted today just for our family. For a brief moment, there was silence, and I could see my father-in-law's smile falter, flickering like a muted TV screen in a dark room, but then my mother-in-law's expression twisted, and it made me physically recoil. "Sweetheart," she said in that deceptively soft tone that made my skin crawl, "you don't want to spoil the holiday spirit, do you?" My husband stepped up to diffuse the tension, but a knot tightened in the pit of my stomach, and before I knew it, I was leading the children upstairs, almost dragging them from the scene that morphed into an argument between my husband and his parents, a battle of wills that would shatter the already fragile thread of our Christmas. I tucked the kids under my arms like precious jewels, whispering to them that everything would be okay, but their wide eyes mirrored the confusion I felt too. I could almost hear my own heart pounding above the muffled shouts from downstairs, like a metronome marking the passage of time, and despite knowing we were safe up there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent was brewing just out of sight. When I heard silence settle like dust in the aftermath of their words, I finally ventured down the hallway, only to witness the scene of my husband sitting on the couch, face pale, looking utterly broken as his parents stood above him, faces still twisted with that disconcerting blend of disappointment and determination to claim their power. "I can't believe you'd deny your children this happiness," my mother-in-law hissed. My mind spiraled, torn between wanting to run back upstairs and wanting to protect my husband from this mental assault, but when I stepped into the room, all eyes turned to me, and I instantly regretted it. "Look what you're doing to him," I shouted before thinking, and my voice echoed like a bell in a deserted abbey, cutting their glares into shards that sliced at the very fabric of our family. My husband's eyes flickered to me with a strange mixture of shame and longing, the pleading look in them begging me to stop, but there was no stopping it now. The moment had escalated into chaos, civil war waged over the rights to Christmas morning, and I felt the darkness closing in around us, a smothering shroud threatening to choke the life out of my children's excitement. I couldn't take it, couldn't breathe in that suffocating atmosphere filled with resentment, and I grabbed my kids, ushering them back upstairs, with a scream trapped in my throat. My heart pounded as our little family barricaded ourselves in, the noise of their increasingly furious voices fading into the background until all I could hear was the sound of my children's confused whispers. I tried to reassure them with soft words, but how could I explain the evils that lurked outside that door? My husband joined us moments later, yet the defeat on his face was a mirror reflecting the horrible reality. This year's Christmas was shattered, our joy stolen, and as he pulled us together, it felt like a fragile house of cards, just waiting for one more gust of wind to take it down. Hours passed, my stomach twisted in knots while the sun crept into the sky, illuminating the shadows of our crumbling home until finally, we heard the door slam. A rush of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived when my husband dared to open the door. When he peeked out, I quickly felt something dark brewing in his gaze, the kind that made my heart sink into my stomach. He turned to me, eyes glazed with disbelief, and whispered, "They're gone." The heaviness in the air was almost tangible, and I knew, in that instant, that things would never be the same. We came together, holding our children close, but the feeling of dread never left. How could we ever celebrate Christmas the same? Each year afterwards became a reminder of that singular moment, wrestling against the ropes of doubt and discontent that our own families tied around us, leaving my husband and I in a constant battle to keep our children's innocence untarnished while the darkness of anger and grief loomed just beyond the walls. I realized with a sinking heart that Christmas wasn't merely a day, it became a symbol, a battleground in my mind, a reminder that in-laws could bring a darkness unlike any other, slowly creeping in like a thief of joy, and whether it was worth the cost of keeping them away on that one single day would haunt me for the years to come. I'm not one to air my dirty laundry in public, but this has started to feel like a living nightmare, and I can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. It began a few months ago when my husband, Greg, started bringing home a collection of vintage radios he found at estate sales. I thought it was a quirky yet harmless hobby, but soon his obsession took a twisted turn. He'd spend hours tinkering away in our dimly lit basement, meticulously restoring each radio, which at first felt endearing, but later it morphed into something more sinister. It was the way he talked to them, like they were old friends or confidants. He'd sit cross-legged on the floor, fiddling with the dials, murmuring, "It's all right, buddy, we'll get you fixed up soon," and I couldn't shake off the chill running down my spine each time I heard him. It drove me mad with worry, yet I brushed it off as one of those midlife crises that men seem to have. Then one night, after another exhausting day at work, I just snapped. I stood at the foot of the basement stairs, shivering as I listened to another muffled, almost pleading voice emanating from the radios, distorted but strangely urgent. Suddenly, a cacophony of static interrupted the night, and the voice seemed to weave through the cracks, promising unseen things like events to come or secrets better left unearthed. My heart raced, and I screamed down the stairs, "Shut up, Greg." It echoed in the walls, reaching an unnatural pitch as an unsettling silence fell over the room. I just wanted it to end, his nights of obsessive tinkering that pulled him deeper into madness while I stood helpless, watching him slip away, one radio at a time. He appeared moments later, confusion painted on his face, and I saw the way he almost flinched at my outburst. I panicked, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. "It's not me," he insisted, his voice trembled, emotion heavy in the silence. But it couldn't have been anything else. I noticed a new radio near the stairs, an old RCA model with the eeriest of designs, weathered and tarnished, as if it had been pulled from a grave. "You have to stop this," I begged, my voice cracking, tears blurring my sight as shadows flickered in the corner of my vision. He turned away, mumbling something I couldn't decipher, racing back into the basement as the static returned, washing over me like a haunting wave. Almost nightly, Greg would descend into that basement filled with technological nightmares, each repair entrenching him deeper in a cycle, while I lay awake, haunted by the murmurings of voices that twisted through the floors like an underground river of secrets. The static grew louder, more persistent, rising in unison with my anxiety until insomnia claimed its throne. My husband, so consumed by whatever he was chasing, became a ghost in our home. I missed the small gestures, his laughter, and the warmth we'd once shared. "You'll regret it," a voice floated from the radio one evening, its tone chilling, as if it were mocking my desperate pleas to save my husband and reclaim the life we once had. I decided I couldn't let it spiral any further. I rummaged through the basement one evening, ready to confront whatever was festering in the dark when I felt the radios watching me. More than just machines, they were menacing, malevolent eyes that drew me into their magnetic hold. That night, I pulled one from its place beneath Greg's clutter and brought it back upstairs, flinging it onto the kitchen table. "You want to talk?" I shouted, edging closer as I flipped the switch on. A jarring screech filled the air, and I immediately regretted the choice. I could have sworn I felt a chill grip my heart as I crouched near it. Rather than finding the static, I heard a voice clearer than before, yet it was Greg's, wrapped in layers of regret and something darker. "I told you not to listen." My stomach sank, pulling me deeper into a black pit of fear as I realized this was not just a radio, it was a vessel, a conduit for something that had crept into our lives, turning my husband into a hollow shell consumed by static and whispers of things I couldn't understand. "Make it stop," I pleaded, desperation clawing at my throat as the voice twisted my thoughts around like vines choking the life from a tree. The radio crackled. "You should have listened." I dropped it, my heart pounding like a war drum, the echoes haunting my mind, and in that instant, Greg stood behind me, his eyes wild, unfocused as if he were looking through me rather than at me. I took a step back, fear radiating from my every sense, and mumbled an apology, but all he did was shake his head slowly, a sorrowful expression creeping across his features. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice breaking as he reached out, fingers trembling as they brushed against the vintage radio, almost as if trying to beg it for forgiveness. "It won't end until I'm finished." Something in me snapped anew as I knew I had to take a stand. So much of him was trapped down there, I could feel it like a frayed string of yarn unraveling into madness, and before he could fully comprehend, I grabbed the radio, my heart racing, smashing it against the floor with a sickening crack, the voice wailing as pieces exploded. In an instant, his expression morphed into a sharp, raging understanding, like a fuse had been lit. "What have you done?" Silence fell like a heavy blanket as I held my breath, terrified I'd unleashed some unknown horror. When he lunged at me, it surprised even myself. I flung myself backward, landing against the countertop, my heart racing like a runaway train. "You're not yourself," I shouted back at him, my own panic-laden voice filled with the raw edge of fear. And suddenly, it became apparent, this wasn't just a hobby gone awry, it was something greater, clawing into every crevice of our lives, testing our trust, our love, and I realized that letting it consume us would mean losing everything I held dear. The basement rattled, a deep rumble emanating from below, as if the radios were screaming all at once, unseen cries of the damned that echoed through our home. I felt fragile from the weight it threatened to crush me with, and as I faced my husband, seeing the shadows of the old radio flickering behind him, despair washed over me. But it wasn't just despair, it was a promise, a whisper caressing my ear, warning me of the dark abyss waiting to swallow us whole if I didn't fight with everything I had left. "We can fix this," I shouted, emotions surging like tidal waves, "but you need to see the truth." His expression shifted, and for a moment, the shadows behind him seemed to relent, flickering like fading embers, as if my words echoed just enough to ignite a flicker of clarity deep within him. With each heartbeat, I felt the bond trying to mend, the air charged with the remnants of names unspoken and hopes tethered to unseen forces. "Please." I barely managed to breathe, tears flooding my vision. "I don't want to lose you." And just like that, something sparked in those hollow eyes. For a split second, I saw my husband emerge from the depths of shadows, an insistent flicker of warmth breaking through the cold facade. But then the shadows behind Greg twisted malevolently, deep laughter, sly and insistent, trickled out, reminding me of how close he had come to losing himself entirely. The moment shattered as I felt chilling breaths emanating from the ruins of the shattered radio, its remnants still alive with echoes of things unnamed. I stormed out, but as I reached the front door, turning back nervously, my heart sank. His silhouette was gone, and in its place was an impenetrable dark, with static rising hauntingly in the air. "Shut up!" I screamed into the void, a raw shout of defiance against the encroaching darkness. In the eerie stillness that followed, I genuinely wondered if I would ever get my husband back, or if he was now nothing more than a note in a forgotten song, static lost to the frequencies of madness. And now, as I type this, I keep glancing at that basement door, terrified that one day I might hear his voice calling, urging me to join him in the void, asking if I would finally understand what it meant to listen. Or if in that moment, I'd finally lose my last chance to save him from the creeping horrors that whispered in the night. I always thought of my sister as my best friend, but everything changed when she married Mark. He was charming at first, but something about him gave me the creeps, like he was always watching, calculating. When they moved into the same town, I was excited to be closer to her, but the more I interacted with Mark, the more I sensed his controlling nature lurking beneath the surface. I'd find myself cringing at the way he spoke to her, each word coded in a smug arrogance that seemed to grow brazen as time went on. He'd often interrupt her, making her laugh off his jabs like they were just bad jokes while I could see the hurt flash across her face. I tried to talk to her about it once, but she brushed it off, insisting he was just being protective, and I could feel an icy wall build between us as she defended him. But there was something inside me that refused to back down. It felt wrong, like watching a slow train wreck you were powerless to stop. Then one afternoon, as I walked by a florist, an idea sprouted in my mind, dark, mischievous, and maybe a little vindictive. I decided to send her flowers anonymously, nothing too extravagant, just a simple bouquet with a note that read, "You deserve better." At first, I thought it would lift her spirits, a small reminder that she was loved outside of her marriage, but when I saw the hurt in her eyes during dinner as she showed them to Mark, everything took a horrifying twist. He exploded, throwing around accusations that I was trying to seduce her, that I'd always been jealous of their relationship, and my heart sank as I realized the depth of his paranoia. To keep the peace, she apologized, but I swore I saw a flicker of recognition in her gaze, a silent acknowledgement that maybe I was right. The next week, I sent another bouquet, more elaborate this time, with a note that said, "You're worth so much more than this." Her laughter was hollow when she showed them to Mark, who turned scarlet, eyes blazing. He snapped at her, demanding to know who was sending the flowers, and this time, I could see the chains tightening around her. The fragile smile she offered cracked under the weight of his fury, and I felt sick to my stomach knowing I was the catalyst for his wrath. I thought she'd open up to me, confide in me about how she felt trapped, but instead, she retreated into herself, and for weeks, I would hear her forced laughter from the other room, as if she were trying to convince herself everything was fine. I hesitated to send another bouquet, but my urge to protect her consumed me. It screamed that I had to keep hope alive somehow. So, I decided to send a single red rose with the note, "Remember who you are." When she found it, Mark threw a fit so intense I could hear him all the way from my apartment, the walls shaking with his forced masculinity. I worried he'd become abusive, prayed he wouldn't cross that line, but every time I saw her, I sensed more cracks appearing in her facade. I could tell she was unhappy now. The strained look on her face told me everything I needed to know, but still, she didn't say a word to me. Days turned to weeks, and with every flower, I felt the line between caring older brother and meddling lunatic blurring. One night, I received an unmarked envelope on my doorstep, and when I opened it, my heart stopped. It was a photograph of me taken from an angle that could only have been taken from the window of my apartment, followed by an ominous note saying, "Stop." Fear gripped me, tightening like a vice. I knew it was Mark, threatening me that I was crossing some line, but a part of me didn't care. I contemplated reaching out to my sister, but I knew it would only unleash hell. I was trapped in this spiral, unable to save her without destroying our relationship entirely. As I lay awake at night, the resolution to protect her only grew. Mark was a disease, and I was an antibiotic trying to fight it, so I decided to make one last move. I hired a private investigator to gather evidence, to follow Mark and see who he really was, hoping I could save her from whatever hell he had dragged her into. The investigator uncovered chilling truths. Mark had a record of harassment with previous girlfriends, and he'd been reported multiple times for suspicious behavior. Armed with evidence, I finally confronted my sister, pouring out everything I had learned in a desperate attempt to reach her. But instead of relief, something in her demeanor changed. Her eyes hardened as she turned away, and my heart sank. She called Mark immediately, and when he arrived, the storm that followed was catastrophic. He accused me of stalking him, of invading our lives, and I was filled with such dread when she didn't defend me that I knew I had lost her. My heart twisted as I realized the depths of her loyalty to him, a loyalty he had fostered through manipulation and fear. That night, I sat in fog-filled despair, staring at the walls of my lonely apartment, my phone buzzing with messages from my sister saying she never wanted to talk to me again, that I had ruined her life. My gut twisted. The only sound in the room was my shaky breaths as I mourned the loss of her light in my life. But then, just as I thought things couldn't get worse, the investigator called me with urgent news. Mark had a plan to leave the state with my sister. Panic coursed through my veins like ice as I rushed to her apartment, ready to beg her to stay, to fight for her. But when I arrived, I found the door ajar, the shadows inside stretching like nightmares, and the heavy quiet beckoning me to step into what felt like doom. I called out her name, dread flooding my senses, and when I stepped inside, the chilling sight I found left my heart in shards. The living room was a mess, overturned furniture, shattered glass, and in the center of it all, my sister, the fear painted across her face, standing before Mark who was seething with rage. I didn't recognize the man I once thought charming. He was a monster now, and before I could think, my protective instincts kicked in. I lunged forward, and what followed was a blur. Mark shouted something about betrayal, and as I fell, the two of us clashed in a tangle of limbs and fury. In that moment, I knew I had crossed a line, but my concern morphed into desperation as I tried to shield her from his rage. Then, in an instant, it shifted. I suddenly saw the fear in her eyes, but not for Mark. She was afraid of me. The realization hit hard as I stumbled back, horror-stricken to see her stance alongside him. "You have to leave. You're only making everything worse," she screamed, and the betrayal pierced through me like a knife. As the weight of her words sank in, I felt the ground fall beneath me, devastation swirling in my chest like a vast ocean of despair. The door slammed shut behind me as the frantic isolation pressed in around me. I grasped the fire escape's railing, doubled over in disbelief, then sat numbly against the cool metal, feeling the world morph into a blurred haze. That's when I realized it. I had become the monster. All my actions, my desperate attempts to save her had only led to more suffering. In trying to rescue her from a controlling husband, I had become someone who cornered her into a space of fear. And as I sat there overcome with emptiness, the shadows around me grew more oppressive. I could almost hear Mark's smug laughter echoing in the stillness, and for a fleeting moment, a chilling thought took root. Maybe those flowers had turned into something dark. Were they ever truly about helping her, or had I just harmed the only person I loved? At that moment, I realized I would never be able to sleep soundly again. Last summer, my friend Brian dared me to jump on his new trampoline after school, but I just shrugged it off, claiming I wasn't in the mood. Honestly, I felt a strange unease whenever I went near it, as if it were more of a portal than a simple backyard attraction. Brian was relentless, teasing me about being scared and insisting that it was perfectly safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. You see, he had gotten that trampoline the previous weekend, almost impulsively, after attending a yard sale that offered it for a steal because the family was moving away quickly. As I tried to walk away from his persistent offers, I overheard Brian mention something about how the trampoline seemed alive to his little brother, Timmy, who was only 5 and had already developed this eerie attachment to it. I chuckled nervously, brushing off the remark, but later that night, I heard Timmy's laughter drifting into my window, and the sound was oddly distorted, a kind of echoing giggle that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. When I told Brian about it the next day, he downplayed it, saying Timmy was just being a kid. Still, I couldn't help but remember the murmurings I had heard from the other kids at school, whispers about the last owners of that trampoline, the couple who vanished without a trace, leaving their house in disarray and their yard littered with the remnants of a normal family life. As days turned into weeks, and each day brought an increasing intensity of Timmy's obsession with the trampoline, I became more uneasy. I could often see him out there, springing into the air, laughing uncontrollably as if the trampoline was buoying him to new heights of joy. But every now and then, he would stop mid-jump, tilting his head as if listening to something from the shadows of their large oak tree. Finally, one late afternoon, I relented and agreed to join Brian and Timmy. As I climbed onto the trampoline, the surface felt unnaturally warm under my feet, almost pulsing, like it had a heartbeat. I tried to force a smile, bouncing gently, but that sensation of unease returned tenfold. It wasn't fear of falling, it was an instinctive dread that clawed at my stomach, warning me to get out before it was too late. Within minutes, Timmy returned to jumping, his laughter now edging towards something sinister. He would occasionally stop, staring wide-eyed at the ground, and that's when it hit me. I couldn't quite tell if he was laughing or if he was being called to something I couldn't see, a siren song that made him float just a little too close to the edge of sanity. That night, I lay in my bed, tossing and turning, unable to shake the feeling that the trampoline had changed something in Timmy. It wasn't just a plaything anymore. I can't explain it rationally, but I started having dreams, vivid and grotesque, dreams of wide-open spaces and crooked shadows, of children jumping in circles, their laughter resonating into an empty abyss. I woke in a cold sweat, and when I glanced out the window, there was Timmy again, bouncing on the trampoline beneath the pallid light of the moon, but this time, it was just him, alone, with that faint aura of something in the air, a palpable tension simmering beneath the surface. By the end of that week, Timmy's parents pulled him away from the trampoline, claiming it was time for bed. But I knew better. I could see how the glow of the moonlight dimmed to a dull hue, the energy changing palpably as their home became quieter. The very next morning, though, I was jolted awake by the sound of frantic knocks on my door. It was Brian, panting and wide-eyed. He said Timmy had vanished from his room, and the last time anyone saw him, he had been headed toward the trampoline. My heart raced as we sprinted down the street, the sun glaring down unforgivingly, making our urgency feel desperate. As we neared the house, I could sense an oppressive aura surrounding that backyard, as if the air itself was warning me. We found Timmy standing still on the trampoline, fully awake, staring deeply into the air above him. Brian called out to him, but there was no response. He didn't even blink. I felt paralyzed. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced with a heavy silence that froze the bone. I grabbed Brian and pulled him back as I gasped for breath. I suddenly realized that Timmy looked older, his little face somehow transformed by the week's events. Then, just like that, he jumped. And kept going. Higher and higher, defying all laws of gravity, until he reached an impossible altitude, hovering suspended in midair with a glint of wild joy in his eyes, a dark and glittering promise that horrified me. "Timmy, get down," Brian shouted in desperation as I felt my stomach drop. Something was terribly wrong. Timmy turned and held out a tiny hand, as if inviting us to join him in that eerie state of bliss, but it was too late. Before we could comprehend what was happening, he was swallowed by a cloud of shadows that erupted from the edges of the trampoline, swallowing the sunlight and everything with it, leaving us standing breathless on a hollow lot, gasping at the absence of laughter where there once was pure childhood joy. I was left haunted by the thought that I had refused to jump that day, that despite my instincts screaming at me to stay away from that thing, I did nothing to protect Timmy. I watched as Brian collapsed to his knees, screaming for his brother in desperation, while I stood rooted on the ground, knowing the truth that I could never share, that sometimes, the thrill of the jump is a gateway to something darker, something that doesn't want to be found. Weeks passed, but the trampoline remained there, a grim reminder of our stupidity, our refusal to listen to instinct rather than the shrieking laughter of a child that felt all too inviting. To this day, I wonder if giving in would have turned the tides, if perhaps Timmy and I could have escape those sinister depths together, but now, all I hear is the echo of his laughter from the lifeless backyard, making me question, was I truly the idiot for not jumping on that trampoline? I've been living with my foster parents for almost 3 years now, and when they first took me in, I felt a flicker of hope after the chaos of my biological family, but that hope quickly fizzled out like a cheap candle. They were nice at first, taking me to parks and letting me choose my favorite meals, but little by little, they began imposing rules that felt suffocating, especially when they decided that they had the right to put parental controls on my iPhone, the one my biological parents gave me before everything went south. That phone was a lifeline. It held pictures of my real mother laughing with me at the beach, messages from my father that said he'd always love me no matter what, and even a few voicemails I kept because they felt like echoes of a past life I couldn't fully remember. When my foster parents broached the subject of parental controls, suggesting it was for my safety, maybe even to protect me from myself after they caught me watching some videos that spiraled into dark territory, I was furious. It felt as if they were digging a grave for my memories, trying to erase everything I had left of my real family. My fists clenched as I remember their voices, calm, yet deceptively firm, telling me it was for my own good. I felt small and powerless as they explained how the internet was a dangerous place, filled with shadows lurking behind every click, as if I'd somehow be safe behind their so-called protective measures. But I'd rather risk it all, dive headfirst into a digital abyss than let them erase the last remnants of my past. I protested, argued, even begged, and when that got me nowhere, I went quiet and resolved to keep my phone a secret from them, using it late at night, crouched under my blanket with the screen dimmed to avoid detection. I fell deeper into the rabbit hole of dark web forums and conspiracy theories, where like-minded souls gathered to share their secrets and fears, convincing myself that they understood the depths of my grief far better than anyone in my foster home ever could. On those sleepless nights, I discovered far more than I ever wanted to know: stories of people who had lost loved ones, tales of sinister disappearances, and whispers of a dark underbelly that thrived in the forgotten corners of the internet. I didn't realize how consumed I was becoming until I encountered a user named Shad0W who claimed he could help people cross over and re-establish contact with the dead using only technology. I was skeptical but intrigued by this account. He had a strange allure, a quiet confidence that drew me in like a moth to a flame. I began engaging with his posts, my curiosity overriding my alarm bells, convinced that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to communicate with my parents again, to hear their voices one last time. Shed0W claimed he needed a special device, the type of thing used in the old ghost hunting shows and a few creepy YouTube channels. I had never considered going beyond my phone, but Shed0W assured me that he had the secrets to make my iPhone a portal, a tether to the world I lost touch with. With his encouragement, I snuck out one moonless night to grab the necessary supplies: a broken radio, a battery pack, and several wires from the old electronics my foster parents tossed out. I felt a thrill run through me as I pieced it together in my room, convinced that while the world saw darkness, I was simply on the brink of a glorious rebirth. As I wrapped the last wire around the makeshift contraption, I felt a jolt of adrenaline. I set everything up, my heart thumping loudly in my chest, hoping this wouldn't just be another wild goose chase. I wanted to believe it would bring me closure. As the clock struck midnight, I opened a chat window with Shad0W, typing frantically, my fingers almost slipping over the screen from the sweat of my anticipation. He told me to make a noise, anything, and focus on the memories I still cherished, the laughter of my real mother and the promises of my father echoing like whispers in my mind. I followed his instructions, my breath hitching as I began to hum a lullaby my mother used to sing. And then, as I held my breath waiting for something, anything, the air around me crackled to life. At first, it was silence, and I thought I was being foolish, but then the radio I'd fashioned let out a high-pitched squeal that made me recoil, and the lights flickered as if responding to my intentions. My phone screen began to blur, the images of my parents rippling like reflections in disturbed water. Suddenly, I heard static, followed by indistinct voices, growing louder and clearer. It was my mother's laughter and my father's deep chuckle weaving together in a painful symphony. I reached out, desperate to bridge the gap, to connect to the only family I'd ever truly felt was mine. As I continued to hum, the voices grew frantic, and an icy chill crawled up my spine, a sense of urgency twisting in my gut. And then, just like that, a voice that wasn't my mother's erupted through the static. "Stop it. Please stop." It was low, plaintive, almost begging, and the warmth of hope quickly twisted into something far more sinister. I felt bile rise in my throat as the tone shifted, becoming furious, accusing me as if it were a vengeful spirit. "You're not supposed to be here." My heart raced, dread pulsing through me as I realized I might have done something horribly wrong, awakening something I could never comprehend. I tried to pull back, to disconnect, but I was paralyzed as shadows began to stretch along the walls, writhing and shifting like dark bile. I could feel their icy breath on the back of my neck, whispers flooding my ears, growing louder. "You're not family. You're not family." Fleeing into panic, I threw my phone across the room, shattering the fragile link, the echoes of their fury clawing at my skin. The shadows receded, leaving nothing but an oppressive silence, but the scar of that encounter would never vanish. I stumbled into the living room in a haze, my heart still pounding as I faced my foster parents, who woke up alarmed by the commotion. Their eyes widened as they saw me, trembling and wide-eyed, and for the first time, I felt the weight of their concern, genuine and terrified, yet I could hardly stand it. They immediately gathered around me, asking questions I didn't know how to answer, probing for an explanation of what had transpired in the dark corners of my mind. I wanted to scream that it wasn't my fault, that I had desperately sought solace and instead summoned only trouble, but the words stuck in my throat. The fear in their eyes stung like 1,000 needles, and just like that, I realized I had no choice. I had insulted my own reality, tearing apart the fragile threads of stability they had attempted to weave around me. As they held me, their warmth was suffocating instead of comforting. It only reminded me of the loss, the real family lost in shadows and confusion. I didn't want them probing deeper, I didn't want to tell them what happened. But that night turned from chaos to something else. It morphed into quiet nights full of investigations into my behavior, full of therapy openness and communication strategies over therapy sessions. They came to discover the extent of my misadventures on the internet and decided to enforce parental controls, the very thing I had fought against, drowning me in an irony bitter enough to make me sick. With each layer they placed on my phone, I felt not protected, but restrained, confined within the walls of their good intentions, a prisoner to their version of safety. My biological family was gone and unreplaceable, and somehow, my foster family turned from bastions of hope into an extension of confinement. I began to wonder, AITA, for trying to cling to the last pieces of my past, for wanting a connection that, as the dreadful echoes of that night reminded me, perhaps ought to remain severed, void of voices calling from the dark. I never thought a simple act of love would spiral into a nightmare, but here I am, trapped in a dark web of regret and horror. It all began when my daughter, Claire, who had been a vibrant light in my life, introduced me to her partner, Mia, and their gorgeous twin daughters, Lily and Rose. They were the kind of girls who left trails of glitter and laughter wherever they went, but with their busy lives and my own responsibilities, I felt that a handmade gesture would reconnect us all. So, I spent weeks sewing 2 cozy, colorful quilts adorned with intricate patterns of flowers and butterflies, one for each girl. The day I presented them, the delight in their eyes made every cut and stitch worth it, and at that moment, I basked in their joy, never knowing the darkness that lay ahead. It wasn't long after that, on a seemingly ordinary weekend, that strange things began to happen. It started when Lily fell ill with what Claire insisted was a common cold, but the next day, Rose also came down with the same symptoms. Then, a week later, Claire reached out to me in a panic. The girls had developed strange rashes on their arms and legs that seemed to flare up after curling up under the very quilts I had made. I felt a prick of unease, but I dismissed it, thinking it must have been an adverse reaction to the fabric I had used. "They'll be fine," I reassured her, though my heart was pounding as I hung up the phone. Then, more disturbing occurrences began to pile up. The family's cat, a fluffy tabby named Muffin, went missing, and one night I distinctly heard hushed voices coming from the girls' room. Concerned, I knocked, and Claire opened the door just enough to peek through, her face as pale as the moonlight illuminating the hallway. I could see the girls huddled under the blankets, whispering, but not talking to anyone as I recognized, perhaps playing some innocent game. Yet their giggles seemed unnaturally high-pitched and echoed unsettlingly in my ears. I brushed it off as growing pains of parenthood and carried on, crafting more quilts to send their way in a futile attempt to brush the darkness away. That wrong turn led me down a path of disbelief when one evening, as I looked through my sewing supplies, I stumbled upon something horrifying, tiny strips of fabric that looked almost like hair. Horrified, I collapsed into a parent's worst nightmare. The girls weren't just playing, they were weaving something darker than I could fathom. I found myself waking up in cold sweats, the images of my beloved grandchildren flickering in flame-like visions, the sound of their laughter turning into shrill screams. Barely sleeping, I found myself almost instinctively checking in on them more often, but each visit felt more shadowy than the last. One Friday night, driven by an unfathomable pull, I decided to follow those haunting whispers. It led me to the door of their room once more, but this time something shifted in me. Instead of fear, a deep curiosity consumed me. Peeking through the crack made my breath hitch. The girls were seated cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a circle of candles illuminating a strange symbol drawn in chalk. Before them lay the quilts, their colors appearing almost too vibrant, too alive, and they were using them as an altar of sorts. I opened the door wider, my heart hammering, to find the girls chanting in a language I couldn't comprehend, their innocent faces now twisted into something unsettling, eyes too old for their little bodies, gleaming with a hunger I had never seen before. They turned to me in unison and smiled, revealing teeth that glinted unnaturally in the candlelight. "Join us, Grandma," they chimed, voices thick with something unnameable. I didn't know what to do. Every maternal instinct screamed for me to pull them away from whatever malevolence they were dabbling in. Yet another part of me, perhaps the deeper, darker part, was both terrified and fascinated. I backed away, closing the door quietly, wanting to give them space while also terrified for their safety. I tried calling Claire, but my hands shook too violently to dial correctly as dread choked me. The following week spiraled out of control. The more I tried to distance myself from the girls, the more the dark energy seemed to repulse me. It became evident to me that their rashes had worsened, and I saw a subtle change in Claire too: tangled hair, dark circles under her eyes, a sense of fatigue that aged her rapidly. When I finally managed to pry it from her lips, Claire admitted the girls had started talking about the night of offerings and other strange rituals, things that had no place in a child's imagination, and I felt faint. Panic surged through my veins. I needed to act before it spiraled completely out of control, but every time I tried to confront Mia and Claire, they brushed it off as just childhood imagination, but as their grandmother, I couldn't shake that feeling. I snuck around their house one night while they were out, trying to gather anything unusual. In the attic, buried beneath old toys, I found a tattered book filled with illustrations of symbols and relentless incantations. I flipped through it, confusion giving way to horror as the truth struck me: a dark lineage, a twisted legacy that my family seemed to have avoided, but now threatened to awaken with my innocent gestures of love. I ripped the book shut and stumbled out of the house, barely breathing, feeling the weight of my actions suffocate me. The quilting I thought would bind our family together was pulling me into something far more sinister. A choice had to be made. I began to cut ties, slowly withdrawing from their lives, desperate to protect my own sanity, but the girls grew more insistent, more invasive, as if sensing my fear and reluctance. At a family gathering later, I watched them closely. Something shifted in me when Rose smiled at me, a smile that seemed almost predatory. I felt as though she knew the truth of my cowardice. When I could take it no longer, I gathered everyone and blurted out all I had found, all that I had deciphered from the tattered book. Instead of disbelief, their laughter filled the air again, but it felt different, sharp and menacing. "It's not a game, Grandma," they said in unison, voices layered with something vile that chilled my very spirit. It was too late, I couldn't escape this. As Claire and Mia exchanged glances filled with acknowledgement, my heart sank. "You made a mistake," Claire said, and I felt my pulse quicken. I thought about the blankets, the love I had poured into those quilts, and it hit me: the offerings they spoke of were not mere children's games, and now I knew I was not just the innocent grandmother in this twisted tale. I had woven my own entrapment with every stitch and thread. I looked into the girls' eyes, shivers racing down my spine, realizing that they had drawn me into their machinations far deeper than I dared to believe, and it was there, nestled inside those blankets, where the true monstrosity lay waiting for the moment they decided to claim it. "So," I ask again, "AITA for making my lesbian daughter's children blankets?" It was a red-eye flight from Los Angeles to New York, and after hours of cramped leg space and the constant hum of the engines, I was relieved to finally feel the plane start its descent. As we touched down, the anticipation of reuniting with friends for a long-awaited trip filled me with excitement, but that joy quickly dimmed when the plane rolled to a stop and the chaotic symphony of kids crying and parents shushing them erupted around me. Just as I unbuckled my seatbelt, a mother in the row ahead of me started shouting at her child, a little boy, maybe 5 or 6, who had transformed himself into a living tornado of rage and defiance. He was poised to unleash a tantrum that could rival any natural disaster, kicking the seat in front of him with relentless fury, and then it happened. The mother, rather than reassuring him, began to scream, and her voice pierced through the dull noise of the cabin like a siren, as if the whole plane had become a stage for their performance. When the seatbelt sign turned off and the doors opened, I stood up eagerly, ready to move forward, when this little monster darted into the aisle, throwing his arms up and screaming as if he believed he could bring down the whole aircraft with just his cries. Corners of people's faces contorted with annoyance as frazzled parents tried to reason with the child while he stomped his feet, flailing like a banshee. In my peripheral vision, I noticed an older man behind me. He looked ready to snap, his patience already worn thin by the chaotic scene unfolding before us. As he shouted at the kid to stop acting like that and to get out of the way, I felt an unfamiliar pull of anger rise within me, an unyielding impulse ignited by worn-out anxieties of my own. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was standing there, frozen in indecision, 1,000 possibilities passing through my mind. Should I step aside? Should I yell too? But then an audacious thought crossed my mind: why should I? It wasn't my child throwing a fit, and why was the rest of the world suffering under this child's tantrum? As the tantrum escalated, I stood my ground stubbornly. The boy began crying harder, his wails echoing through the cabin as he kicked his little feet against the aisles, making it impossible for anyone to get past. I watched as parents attempted to calm him down, but their efforts were futile. The little boy's pleading screams devolved into a cacophony of noise that seemed to seep into my very bones. I finally whispered, "You've got to be kidding me," under my breath, just as the elderly man behind me shoved my shoulder gently, signaling me to move aside, but instead, I clenched my teeth and grit my teeth, unwilling to give an inch. "Move," he exclaimed, hitching his backpack and glaring at the kid as if he could force him to cooperate through sheer will. It was surreal watching two adults struggle against the manic outbursts of a child, and in a fit of anger, I turned around and snapped at the man to back off, that this had nothing to do with me, and I wouldn't be the one to budge. My voice was louder than I intended, and a wave rippled through the crowd like I had unleashed some invisible force that suddenly everyone had felt. It silenced the room momentarily, and the little boy looked at me wide-eyed, screen-printed with confusion. The mother, no longer raising her voice, stood still with a glazed expression, her hands frozen on either side of her son, the heat of shame and frustration radiating off her. I was taken aback, realizing I was now at the center of this whirlwind, a moment where rage intertwined with guilt as my heart raced in my chest. I felt a sickening mix of satisfaction and regret, unsure if I had escalated the situation or somehow brought relief. I had thought I was being resolute, but instead, I found myself entangled in an emotional disaster. The tension in the cabin thickened, and as the seconds stretched into forever, the boy finally broke. He let out one last defiant scream and surprisingly spun around, sprinting back to his seat, still crying as loud as his lungs could manage, while parents finally scooped their children up and started to clear the aisle, moving around me like I was an immovable object in a world of chaos. But then something terrifying happened. As he settled back into his seat, I suddenly felt a rush of nausea sweep over me, an all too familiar feeling that accompanied moments of pure dread, a thought creeping into my mind that mirrored the chaos. I hadn't just deemed that child a nuisance, had I? I was now a villain in this story, solidified in place and surrounded by sympathetic glares from onlookers who had witnessed my outburst. Words flared hot at the tip of my tongue as I turned to the older man, a stranger who I now saw as a comrade in this blender of emotions. "I'm sorry," I stammered, a futile attempt to mend the invisible rift that had formed, but he laughed, a low, gravely laugh, and nodded, almost approvingly. "You didn't deserve that. No one did. You're not their babysitter," he replied, causing me to feel both relieved and more lost than ever. It dawned on me in that moment, this whole shambolic episode of human suffering was not only about the child, it was about me as well, but the more I dissected it in my head, the more I knew my reaction was rooted in my own tumultuous past. What I thought was just an inane airplane encounter was turning into a dissection of my own character weaknesses. I had endured far worse moments long before needing an emotional outlet against the harrowing memories that had seeped into my mind over time, of feeling trapped, of feeling like I couldn't escape my own emotional dysfunction that had caused echoes of laughter and anger to crumble into one another through time. It wasn't just about parenting, it was about trauma. This innocent child had opened a can that I wasn't ready to confront, and suddenly a flash of clarity struck me like lightning. What if I needed to be shaken for a reason? Luckily, as the line began to move, I found myself taking my first tentative step toward the exit, lingering behind the furious mother and her misbehaving child, drifting just far enough back to feel safe yet still close enough to engage in the raw humanity of what had unfolded. I made it to the door just behind them, and when we finally stepped into the cool air of the terminal, I caught a glimpse of the boy, still ensnared in his mother's frustrated grip. Their dynamic struck me as bittersweet, two broken souls meeting at an intersection of despair. At the last moment, I realized that the world isn't simply black and white. Every outburst is a story, every tantrum wrapped in layers of the unexplained, and in that instant, I forgave us all, even myself, for simply being human. With every part of me still unsettled, I merged back into the flow of travelers, carrying the weight of that awkward confrontation, caught in a web of empathy that lingered in the air, a breath away from devastation and understanding, and as I walked through the throng of people, I hesitated for just a moment to turn back, half expecting to catch the boy's eye, but instead, I found only the fleeting silhouettes of silhouettes blending into the crowd of hurried passengers, their lives intersecting through the storm, never to meet again.